Welcome again on this fascinating journey of research. We are in the second section of the series of lectures on research. Today we are in the philosophy of research section, and this is the first video where we are going to discuss about structure of research. So let's get started. What is philosophy of research? Let's understand this statement first, that all research is based on certain assumptions about how the world is perceived and how you can best come to understand it. So it's about perceiving the world, it is about holding some assumptions, having some assumptions at place, and ways to describe it. So you just try to fix everything in a frame of logic. That is how you build up one after the other. So there is no research without any assumptions. There has to be some underlying assumptions. There is no research without any perceived reality. It would always be there. You try to perceive the world, and this is beautiful. We never say that the world perceived is so beautifully chosen, because my perception will vary from your perception, and that is why we have a number of school of thoughts. There is no one school of thought in research. So to begin with philosophy of research, we begin with the logical reasoning first. So if you go back and you will try to see how people start philosophizing about how people started describing the world, the human world and its complex realities, you have to subscribe to some kind of reasoning, and whether it is about human realities or matter, you again have to describe in terms of some logical reasoning, some ideas which could connect from one concept to another, and that is how you enter into the domain of deductive approach and inductive approach, your top down and bottom up approach. So if you build from one object and then you try to build up like that is inductive. And if you try to have some broad theory and you try to say that what is true for everyone is true for a part also, you are actually describing it in terms of deductive. We'll discuss about this, not to worry. Next is your structure of research and different philosophical school of thoughts, positivism and post-positivism, validity in research, and major realm of components of research. See, understand all these things. When we say this philosophy of research, what we mean this thing, like the ideas, the assumptions which are there, which makes the foundation stones. So there would be some structure of research also. Research is structured in a way there you build propositions, you apply certain tools, you have certain phases. So there is a structure which follows, and then there are philosophical schools of thoughts. So different schools of thoughts. You remember when you say you were going to your schools is actually your first approach towards organized learning, right? Your home is your first school, but then you move to a school where there are classrooms, so there are certain assumptions which are there. So schools means here like the beginning, how these things started, from where it all started, the beginning of. And you philosophical schools differ in the way they present their ideas about the world. Maybe one way of looking at world would be more in terms of male and female. So you have feminist approach, right? So maybe this could be one approach. You have your way of deterministic reality. You say that everything can be determined, and what you cannot measure, that do not exist. So that is positivism. And then you have post-positivism. So there are different school of thoughts. We are not going to cover every one of them because it is going to be beyond the scope of this research journey. But yes, we will be covering these two approaches which are contemporary and very, very important, at least for any researcher in 21st century. He or she should be aware of positivism and post-positivism in research. The next is your validity in research. Philosophy of research is actually about moving, is about, there is, you build something, you have an aim, you want to measure something, you are trying to describe something, and you end up measuring the same thing. If it is about measurement, you want to study self-esteem and you actually ended up collecting data about self-esteem. So that is to do with validity component in research. This is also part of philosophy of research, understand. And the major realm and component of research, this is about, research will always talk about the plane of abstraction and plane of reality. You remember we have discussed this when we were talking about your theoretical foundations of research and empirical research. Theoretical and empirical, the two magic words of the four, of the five. So plane of reality versus plane of abstractions. So we, major realm and component of research, we try to see causality, cause and effect on both these planes, and we try to understand. Even if you are not able to understand these things and these things are appearing little complicated, please bear with me for some times and you will be able to grasp everything. The idea of this small video is just to give you a gist of what we are going to cover in the second phase of our research journey, which is philosophy of research. So let's move to today's topic, which is the structure of research, and we have this beautiful hourglass notion of research. Hourglass notion, as you could see, there is an hourglass, and which is a very useful tool in earlier days to measure time. And then you begin with certain broad questions in mind. So you always begin with certain broad question, and then you narrow down, focus in, operationalize, observe, analyze, reach conclusions and generalize back to questions. So what is it all about? Let's try to understand it with some example. Let's say a researcher is interested in how to use computers to improve performance of students in mathematics. Now this statement is something very similar to begin with broad question. So the broad question here, the focus is using some computer program to improve students' performance in mathematics. But see, this is far too broad to be studied, far too broad to be studied in any single research project, or even for a single researcher in his entire lifetime, because there would be n number of many kind of computer programs or many kind of computer interventions. And again, you have to define the students of what class, of what age group. Are they students of primary students or secondary students, students who are going in, who are in high school, or maybe who are in college? So how would you define it? So definitely it is too broad. So let's try to narrow down. The next is, you begin with a broad question, that is first. The second one is narrow down, focus in. So what we do is, researcher has to narrow down one that can be reasonably studied in a research project. So reasonably, so do not push many things into one research project. Just try to find out that what can be done. There is always a time limitation within which you have to complete your work. So there are other constraints also. You are not having infinite time to complete your research project. So this will lead you to develop certain hypotheses. That is the third level, which is actually, the third one, which is operationalizing. So operationalizing is all about moving from general to specific. So you are actually moving from general to specific. So what is a specific? A hypothesis is a specific. You hypothesize, let's say, a particular method of computer instruction. Let's say method X will improve the ability of primary school students in a particular district. Now this is very beautifully explained, hypothesized. You could do this into a number of schools in a given district. Let's say you have selected, let's say 50 schools, and you could deploy that method and see that whether it is helping the students to improve their mathematical ability. And now when you do that, Once you do that, you implement, analyze initial conclusions, you come up with your initial conclusion, and finally you attempt to generalize to other related situations. So what do you mean by other related situation? That is here beautifully here. So you actually observe means your data, you collecting your data, and then you're analyzing data, reaching conclusion and generalizing back to the question. So this is what our class notion is all about. So you begin with broad question, and the far reaching idea is again generalizing, right? So that is our class notion, and these are the steps which you have to follow. So that builds a structure of a research. You could pause this video at this for the current slide, and you could just follow these 3 statements. This is very general. From general